You engage in reckless rhetoric with no facts. And to be clear,
I'm not calling for the overthrow of a government. You
put out a newsletter attacking Donald Trump and calling him complicit.
Never attacked Donald Trump.
Yes, you have. And by the way,
I campaigned for Donald Trump.
Okay, yes.
And this is after anti-Semitism, this is the last refuge. You're an anti-Semite and you hate Trump.
Okay,
I love Trump.
I will read. You put out a whole newsletter saying Trump has abandoned America first. And here's what Trump said in response. Well, considering that I'm the one that developed America first and considering that the term wasn't used until I came along, I think I'm the one who decides that. For those people who say they want peace, you can't have peace if Iran has a nuclear weapon. So for all of those wonderful people who don't want to do anything about Iran having a nuclear weapon, that's not peace. That was directed at you.
Man, you got me. Busted.
No, I'm just saying.
Look, my views. Look, I like Trump. I campaigned for Trump. I know Trump. I talked to him last night. I'm not against Trump, and you know that.
But you're against his foreign policy.
I think that we should be very careful about entering into more foreign wars that don't help us when our country is dying.
When you say
and our
don't
country
help
is
us,
dying.
Look, yes, focus on our country. I'm all for it. But the naivete.
You don't even know how much money this costs.
Hey.
You don't know anything about the country whose government you want to overthrow, and you're calling me reckless.
I want to stop a lunatic who wants to murder us from getting nuclear weapons that could kill millions of Americans.
Fair.
You say, I can't see how that benefits America in any way. That is bizarre. And by the way,
bizarre.
Isolationism, your foreign policy is the foreign policy of Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama.
Oh, absolutely.
And it doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm a big leftist. This is so silly. I'm Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama. Okay. Let me just say one last thing.
So how is your foreign policy different from Jimmy Carter's? Seriously.
Please.
I asked that question seriously.
I don't even know what you're talking about. Jimmy Carter?
So
what century is this? I am the product of the last 25 years, watching carefully, being involved in the periphery, and I see an unending string of foreign policy disasters that have impoverished and hurt our country.
Unending string.
Unending string. They would include Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and our inability to stop the Houthis, by the way, in Yemen, which exposes us as weak, and I grieve over that. So these are failures. You helped preside over some of them as a member of the Senate.
What failures, foreign policy failures, have I presided over?
Well, we were unable to beat Russia in the war that you supported against Russia. You've been spending the last 3 years telling us that Vladimir Putin is evil and we're going to beat him with other people's children, and 1 million of those kids are now dead. You've never apologized for that. That was a full failure.
By the way, look, the level of number of falsehoods you lay out just in one statement are rather.
You haven't supported the war against Russia?
Are rather stunning. So the war against Russia was caused, which I have explained at great detail, by Joe Biden's weakness.
But you supported the war.
If you want to talk, we can talk Russia and Ukraine. I'm happy to talk about it.
Do you think that's been a success?
No, it's been an absolute disaster.
Okay, but you supported it. Shouldn't you apologize?
No, you should apologize. I'm not going to engage in the demanding of apologies. So
I'm like, that's my point. Is all these failures and no one ever says I'm sorry.
Matter, or do you just throw out if you want to talk, we can talk.
Okay, I do. I want to know why that seems like a true disaster for the United States. You have supported it.
Do you believe Joe Biden's weakness caused the war in Ukraine?
I think Joe Biden's aggression caused it.
His aggression? What aggression?
He demanded that Ukraine join NATO. How does that help the United States?
It is a terrible idea, and I have vigorously opposed Ukraine joining NATO.
Okay, so that's what caused the war.
No, it's not.
Okay. All right.
Do you want to know what caused the war? Look, you do the dismissive. You're not actually interested in facts. You're like, okay.
Okay, tell me. It seems super obvious. You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry. That is a tick of mine that is wrong. And I mean this with sincerity. I'm sorry to do that to you. I just think it seems so obvious that sending Kamala Harris to the NATO Security Conference to say you're going to join NATO is what triggered the invasion days later. Okay.
So this will take a few minutes to lay out because it's complicated, but I think the facts matter. I think two things caused the war in Ukraine. Number one, I think Biden's incredible weakness and the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, I believe we need to leave Afghanistan, but not with the incompetence that led to 13 servicemen and women being murdered by terrorists there. The way Biden did that was disastrous, and I think our enemies looked to the commander-in-chief and said, this president is weak. And when that withdrawal was so disastrous, I said publicly at the time, the chances of Putin invading Ukraine have just risen tenfold.
Right.
But secondly, and this is critically important.
Well, I agree. That was awful, the withdrawal.
And it was a major cause of our enemies all said, hey, this president is weak. And so it invited, and by the way, look, I despise war. And I think weakness and isolationism produces war because it invites aggression from our bad guys. It's why I agree with Ronald Reagan's peace through strength. The best way you avoid war is being strong enough that your enemies don't want to mess with you. But let's get back to Ukraine and Russia. Look, Putin didn't wake up 2 years ago and decided he wanted to invade Ukraine. He's wanted to invade Ukraine for decades. Putin has referred to the collapse of the Soviet Union as, quote, the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And Putin has long been explicit. His desire is to reassemble the old Soviet Union and, in fact, reassemble the Russian Empire that was even bigger than that. If you want to reassemble the Soviet Union, the natural place to start is Ukraine.
Do you really believe that Putin has territorial designs on Eastern Europe?
Yes.
What countries?
He has said that you can go and read his. Hold on. I don't want to lose the narrative of what happened, so we can go back and do that. But I don't want to lose telling the story first. So let me explain this, and then if you want to go back, we can take all sorts of digressions. But just give me a couple of minutes to lay out the facts of what happened. He has wanted to invade Ukraine a long time, and he's done it before. In 2014, he invaded Ukraine, invaded Crimea. When Barack Obama was president, he invaded the southern portion. He did not invade the rest of the country. Why? And the reason is the principal source of revenue for Russia is oil and gas, and the natural gas pipelines run right through the country of Ukraine, and he didn't want to jeopardize his ability to get gas to Europe.
Right.
So in 2015, Putin started a project called Nord Stream 2.
Did anything happen in 2014?
In terms of what?
Wasn't there a coup in Ukraine run by the Obama administration?
Let me finish telling. I told you we'll take lots of digressions in a second. Let me finish telling the narrative. 2015, Putin began building Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is an undersea pipeline that runs from Russia to Germany. The entire purpose of Nord Stream 2 is when it was completed and turned on, it would let Russia circumvent Ukraine and get its gas straight to Europe. In 2019, Nord Stream 2 was almost complete. And the conventional wisdom in Washington was, this is terrible, but there's nothing we can do about it. I didn't believe that. So I drafted sanctions legislation that was targeted to stop the pipeline. My legislation passed the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support. It passed the House, and Donald Trump signed it into law.
Can I just ask, why wouldn't you want Germany to have cheap energy?
Because it empowers Russia. And I believe in making our enemies weaker and our friends stronger.
Has blowing up Nord Stream made Germany stronger?
Not being dependent on Russia has made Germany stronger.
So you think Germany is stronger now than it was 4 years ago?
I think not being dependent on Russia. Germany has all sorts of problems, and many of them are domestic to their own politics. Hold on, let me finish. I'm trying to.
No, but what you're saying, it doesn't. Germany seems so much weaker now that its energy costs have spiked and the manufacturing sector is collapsing because of that.
Let me finish. I'm focused on America's interest. I don't want Russia stronger because I believe Russia is our enemy. You and I disagree on that. We can talk about that. But I want our enemies weaker. I don't want to go to war with Russia, but I want our enemies weaker. I don't want Europe dependent on Russia. I don't want Putin rich with oil and gas revenues and able to invest in his military and pose a threat to America. So the sanctions legislation that I authored, it passed. Putin stopped building Nord Stream 2 literally the day that President Trump signed my sanctions legislation into law. He signed it, if I remember right, at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. Putin stopped construction at 6:45 p.m. So the sanctions legislation worked, and it killed the pipeline. The pipeline lay dormant for over a year, just a hunk of metal at the bottom of the ocean. Joe Biden came into office. He was sworn in on January 20th, 2021. Putin resumed deep-sea construction of Nord Stream 2 4 days later, January 24th. He did so because Biden had foreshadowed weakness on this issue. That foreshadowing was accurate because several months later, Biden formally waived the sanctions on Nord Stream 2 and let Putin complete the pipeline. In January of 2022, I forced a vote on the Senate floor to reimpose sanctions on Nord Stream 2. The week of the vote, President Zelensky in Ukraine publicly called on the Senate, please pass this sanctions legislation. It is the last best hope of stopping Russia from invading Ukraine. At the same time, the government of Poland put out a formal statement from the foreign ministry to the Senate, calling on the Senate to pass my sanctions legislation, and said, if you do not, Putin will invade Ukraine. The day of the vote, Joe Biden came to Capitol Hill. It's the first time in his presidency he had done that. He went to the Democrat senators' lunch, and he personally lobbied them on this issue, not any other issue. This was his number one issue that he came to lobby them on. They came out of that lunch. Every Democrat had voted with me twice against Nord Stream 2. 44 Democrats flipped their vote. They voted in favor of Russia, in favor of Putin, and 4 weeks later, Russia invaded Ukraine. That was the direct cause of the war. And if Trump had been president, there would be no war in Ukraine.
So may I ask, I, of course, disagree with your analysis completely, but I want to be respectful.
Okay. So tell me what you disagree with.
It's such a long conversation. I've spent the last couple of years on this, and I just respectfully disagree with your analysis. But I don't doubt your sincerity that you believe that Putin is our enemy, that Western Europe should not be allowed to use Russian energy. I mean, you seem to really believe these things. My question is about results, because I think it's relevant to what we're seeing now in Iran. You look back after having you personally voted to send billions and billions and billions of U.S. tax dollars to Zelensky to support his civil service and the war against Russia and all this stuff. Can you say that what you did worked?
So I can say what I did personally, sanctioning Nord Stream 2 worked and prevented a war. And if Trump had still been there, if the sanction had been in effect, there would be no war. I'm in favor of avoiding wars.
But once the war broke out, you voted to fund it to the tune of billions and billions and billions.
And to be clear.
And did that work?
Okay, to be clear, what I voted for the initial tranche of funding, and then I voted against the subsequent one. So it hasn't worked. So I've been in between. I haven't been on the full Ukraine, full-throated hawk side or the anti from day one. I voted for the initial tranche of funding because I wanted Russia to lose. I think the Biden administration administered it in a horrible way. I think they wasted a ton of money. And I think what they did was actually incoherent because they were funding both sides of the war. I was very vocal and among other things, flooding $100 million to Iran, which was used, among other things, to help the nuclear program, but also to make drones that Russia used to fight.
So here's my concern. I'm not going to defend the Biden administration. Really did a lot to wreck the United States.
Yeah, did the most damaging administration
in history. At the end, where we sit now, Russia is stronger. It's closely allied long-term with China.
I don't know that Russia's stronger. I don't think that's right.
Okay. I think it's pretty obvious that it is. But it's certainly not destroyed. And it's allied long-term with China.
Maybe. That there's no doubt Biden's foreign policy drove Russia into the arms of China, and that's concerning. Okay. They also have a long history of animosity.
Western Europe is weaker and more in debt. The United States is weaker and much more in debt. Hold on. So you and I are agreeing on a lot. We're agreeing. Here's my question. Have you questioned any of your previous assumptions? Did you play any role in this at all? Are you responsible at all?
Of course, and like you said...
What have you learned?
Like you said you've changed your mind.
Yeah,
I voted for the first funding of the Ukraine war, and I voted against every subsequent funding stream because it wasn't working. And I looked at what was happening and said, this is not working. And had the money been spent in an intelligent way and not wasted, and had it been successful, I might have been willing to fund more. But it wasn't successful, so I voted no. And the war's going to end. Look, President Trump campaigned on ending the war. I think he's frustrated because Putin has been less than eager to reach a deal to end the war, but it's going to end. You're not going to see another dollar coming from